They hit that thing so hard they knocked it right off its moorings. Ah, people can't drive anymore.
Attacking the Filipino aircraft vessels, our armed forces will invoke our mutual defense treaty with the Philippines.
Biden says he's not looking for a conflict, but both leaders emphasize the need to compete with Beijing. Biden also vowed to get more funding for the AUKUS deal to get Australia nuclear-powered submarines, a move viewed as another bid to counter China's military ambitions in the Pacific. Meanwhile, as Israel prepares for a ground offensive into Gaza, President Biden today lays out this as his vision about what future he seeks.
Israelis and Palestinians equally deserve to live side by side, ensuring Hamas can no longer terrorize Israel.
And while Biden urges Israel to be incredibly careful to focus on going after Hamas and avoid hurting civilians, he says he has, quote, no confidence in the casualty numbers being reported by the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Coming up, California's governor meets with China's leader Xi Jinping. We'll have more on what they discussed and why. Investigating religious persecution around the world. Why do communist countries actively oppose religious practices? Find out what lawmakers and witnesses say. And a pilot accused of trying to cut a plane's engine mid-flight. He's now in court where new documents say he was on hallucinogenic mushrooms. More shortly here on NTD News.
Comes from their power sector. The country still adds new coal plants every year. Newsom also signed a new climate-focused Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, to advance carbon neutrality and clean energy. The governor and his Chinese counterparts touched upon human rights issues, including Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan. Another topic was the fentanyl crisis and China's role in precursor chemicals.
It's the international Chinese mafia groups behind all this smuggling and this drug trafficking, all these issues.
Next month, world leaders are expected to meet at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC, scheduled for San Francisco. David Lamb, NTD News, California.
Investigating religious
the fall of the Soviet Union and the West's victory at the end of the Cold War, there are a number of communist countries left around the world.
The president of the Religious Freedom Institute testifying before House lawmakers on Wednesday. He says communist regimes usually don't tolerate religious practices. That's because communists require allegiance to the state from its citizens, not allegiance to God.
Religious people are often seen as lacking allegiance because Christians, Muslims, Jews, and other religious people have a higher authority that they worship and that they hold to. So this is why China cracks down on Uyghurs, Falun Gong.
He then went on to say that Chinese leader Xi Jinping especially has been restricting religious and spiritual movements recently, giving the example that no CCP official can be a publicly observant person of faith. The hearing also touched on religious persecution in Nigeria. Radical Islamist groups there are targeting Christians and others.
The persecution of Christians and moderate Muslims is driven by extremist groups there, Boko Haram, ISIS in that region, and the Fulani, that they're attacking these Christian villages because of their faiths.
The hearing also mentioned issues here in America. A leaked memo previously showed that the U.S. Embassy in a Caribbean country had pushed for a political candidate who was pro-abortion. One witness said that because of such actions from the U.S., some religious communities are now more hostile to America and its policies. Ariane Pastar, NTD News.
An airline pilot is now in court. He's mushrooms as his mental health worsened. Here's NTD's Eileen Eng with more.
State prosecutors in Oregon filed 83 counts of attempted murder against 44-year-old Alaska Airlines pilot Joseph David Emerson on Tuesday. His attorney has entered not guilty pleas on his behalf. Federal prosecutors charged Emerson with interfering with the flight crew. The charge can carry up to 20 years in prison. Court documents show Emerson told police he had been struggling with depression after a friend recently died. He said he took psychedelic mushrooms about 48 hours before he attempted to cut the engines. He also said he had not slept in more than 40 hours. Neither the gate agents nor flight crew noticed any signs of impairment that may have barred him from the flight. An FBI agent wrote in a probable cause affidavit in support of the federal charge that Emerson said it was his first time taking mushrooms. One of his neighbors in Pleasant Hill, California, finds it hard to believe that a family-oriented gentleman would do such a thing.
Right now, my question is, did he do it? Or was it a joke? And they took it the wrong way? I don't know. But it's one of those questions. I don't see him with his beautiful family risking it. How can he do that when he knows he has a beautiful family at home?
Emerson was arrested Sunday night after the flight crew reported that he attempted to shut down the engines on a Horizon Air flight from Everett, Washington to San Francisco while riding in the extra seat in the cockpit. The plane was diverted to Portland, where it landed safely with more than 80 people on board. The FBI affidavit said Emerson tried to grab two red handles that would have activated the plane's fire suppression system and cut off fuel to its engines. Flight attendants placed Emerson in wrist restraints and seated him in the rear of the aircraft. Alaska Airlines said Tuesday that Emerson had been relieved of all duties. Emerson will remain in state custody pending an initial appearance in U.S. District Court in Portland.
Coming up, Iran is threatening kidnapping. The survivor of several such attempts tells Congress her story. Who's leaving the U.S. may be as important as who's coming in, according to a security expert. How the U.S. may be helping terrorists in Iran's nuclear program. And police arrest a man for breaking into a California home and threatening to kill the family. He reportedly shouted "Free Palestine" during the incident. Details on this and more when we return.
I don't feel safe here at home anymore. My family doesn't feel safe anymore.
Masih Alinejad is an Iranian-American activist. She was forced to leave Iran for being critical of the regime, and she now lives in the U.S., where she fears for her life.
Iranian regime were plotting to kidnap me and take me from Brooklyn by a speedboat to a cargo ship bound for Venezuela and then to Iran. To you, maybe it's a scary movie, but to us, this is the reality. They did that to my colleague in France, and they executed him in Iran.
Alinejad said she's had to move over a dozen times under FBI supervision, and she believes the Iranian regime is responsible. Alinejad says the Biden administration's response has been inadequate because it isn't holding Iran accountable. She says these threats are national security threats.
The Iranian regime's threats to the homeland are real and are growing. They've sought to conduct cyber attacks on our state and local governments and private industry. They've plotted to target and assassinate individuals inside the United States, including former Trump officials.
Congressman Mark Green says that a record number of illegal immigrants are entering the U.S. through the southern border. He's concerned about how Iran could take advantage of that and infiltrate the country to commit acts of terrorism. Former State Department official Nathan Sales believes Iran may have already done so.
Iranian-linked terrorists have been found in the United States. I mentioned Hezbollah, 128 Hezbollah operatives arrested over the years by the FBI. Within that population of however many millions or hundreds of thousands of known gotaways, we should not assume that they are all perfectly clean.
Sales says the Iranian regime hides behind proxies instead of doing things themselves. These proxies include terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iraqi militias. Witnesses at the hearing said Iran also uses criminal organizations, like the European crime syndicate that tried to kill Masih Alinejad, and the Mexican drug cartels that tried to kill John Bolton. Faye Quarter, NTD News.
All this while Iran continues to develop its nuclear weapons program. How is sensitive technological information flowing to Iran, and what can the U.S. do to address the threat? We spoke with a retired special agent and diplomat and author of the book Switched On. Eric Karen, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you on the show.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
With the Israel-Hamas war ongoing, there's been a lot of scrutiny of Iran possibly supporting the Hamas terrorist group. And now this comes after the recent Iran hostage swap, where we also unfroze $6 billion. Now, the U.S. administration is saying Iran can't access those funds due to current events. How do you see the Iran deal fitting in with this war in Israel?
Well,
I think it's a travesty that we did this deal. Iran has declared war against Israel and the U.S. They're responsible for the deaths of dozens of U.S. soldiers in Iraq, and we should not be negotiating with a state sponsor of terror. It only emboldens them, and we see what they're doing today. They have proxies all around the Middle East. They have militias, some 19 militia groups all over the Middle East, targeting the U.S., targeting U.S. servicemen. We essentially are at war. They declared war against us, and we need to take the gloves off against Iran and start taking the threat seriously before it's too late.
And Eric, on the point of negotiations, the U.S. has celebrated the Americans we got back, but what about the Iranians we released? What do we know about them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think it was a fair deal. I don't think Donald Trump would have settled for this deal because, we essentially gave to Iran international arms traffickers who were providing sensitive military technology for their WMD programs. That's weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, chemical, missile technology that is facing us, that we are the target of those WMD weapons in Israel. And so these individuals should not have been released. They should have been charged with espionage because they harmed the interests of the U.S. They were providing sensitive military technology to Iran. And we see today some of that technology is being used today against U.S. servicemen in drones, in missiles. We think about border security as just inbound. We need to think about border security as what's leaving America, destined for terrorist countries such as Iran.
And on the point of the technology,
this included rocket and drone attacks in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. And now it turns out that Iran was behind at least some of these, although should note they were not too serious. The White House has now declared, though, that Iran is actively facilitating rocket and drone attacks on U.S. military bases, at least in Iraq and Syria. President Joe Biden cut a recent press conference short as he was informed of the news. Biden was rushed into the Situation Room, and he only briefly told reporters that, "I apologize, I have to go to the Situation Room for another issue I have to deal with." It turned out that the attacks we mentioned were taking place last week have since escalated. On Monday morning, U.S. forces were attacked a second time at the Al-Tanf base in Syria. They were targeted by 2 drones, although no injuries were reported. I mentioned last week as well that the groups behind some of the attacks are tied to Iran. That was known. It was suspected they were coming from Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. At the time, though, it wasn't confirmed which groups the attacks in Syria and Iraq were coming from. But that's now changing. The White House declared on Monday that it believes the terrorist attacks are being supported directly by the Iranian government and by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC. White House spokesman John Kirby said, "We know that Iran is closely monitoring these events and in some cases actively facilitating these attacks."
Iran is closely monitoring these events and in some cases actively facilitating these attacks and spurring on others who may want to exploit the conflict for their own good or for that of Iran.
He added that they're aware that Iran is trying to maintain a degree of plausible deniability, but he noted, "We also are not going to allow any threat to our interests in the region to go unchallenged." Now, on Saturday, the United States also declared it was sending additional ballistic missile defense systems to the Middle East. The United States is sending a Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD system, along with additional Patriot Air Defense Missile System battalions to the region. Now, these systems are able to intercept ballistic missiles, which can carry chemical or biological munitions, as well as nuclear warheads. And this could really just be the beginning. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said in a statement that following detailed discussions with President Joe Biden on recent escalations by Iran and its proxy forces across the Middle East region, today I directed a series of additional steps to further strengthen the Department of Defense's posture in the region. Did you get that? The United States is now going to be sending additional military forces to the Middle East. It's not clear exactly how many just yet, but Austin did say that he's now placing troops on prepare to deploy orders. That's in addition to the existing 2,000 U.S. troops who are already assigned to a heightened state of readiness for potential deployment. The U.S. is also moving the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower aircraft carrier to support this mission. Now, of course, it's debatable how much of an escalation this is for the U.S. military, but it's a bit ironic that the Biden administration withdrew key defense systems from the Middle East, 2 years ago. This was done under claims that tensions with Iran were cooling. Keep in mind that Biden's unfreezing of $6 billion for Iran recently before the attack was also done with the allegations that tensions in the region were cooling. And now we have Iran going right back to the sponsoring of attacks on U.S. forces and its allies. Now, back in 2021, going a little back in time, shortly after Biden came into office, one of his first moves was to withdraw key defense systems from the Middle East. That happened right alongside the botched U.S. troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. But while Afghanistan got most of the attention, the other pullouts were significant as well. As The Hill reported at the time, Biden withdrew 8 Patriot anti-missile batteries from countries including Iraq, Kuwait, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and another missile defense system, again THAAD, from Saudi Arabia, as well as the hundreds of U.S. troops who operate and support those systems. Now, this was in addition as well to troop withdrawals elsewhere and
The man's
the
a
removal of other
moron.
key defense systems in the region. Now, the majority of those defense systems had been moved there under the Trump administration previously, and that followed the 2019 drone attack on a Saudi oil field that was blamed on Iran. It was also in context of an Iranian missile strike on a base housing U.S. troops in Iraq, done again by Iran, which was part of Iran's retaliation from the U.S. drone strike that killed Soleimani. That was one of Iran's top generals, who at the time was accused of plotting an imminent large-scale attack on U.S. troops in Iraq. Now, you might remember as well that Republicans were very angry about Biden's 2021 choice to remove those weapons systems. Senator Ted Cruz had tweeted at the time, Neville Chamberlain, fresh off giving Putin a multi-billion-dollar pipeline, now pledges to withdraw Patriot and THAAD anti-missile systems in the Middle East and facilitate Iran's conquest of the region. And here we are right now, redeploying at least some of these systems to stop Iran's conquest of the region, as it is again facilitating terrorist attacks on U.S. forces. And as this happens, the United States looks like it's playing a few different roles. Like, on one side, the U.S. is standing by and defending Israel. That includes supporting Israel as it launches strikes on Hamas and Gaza. On the other side, the U.S. is playing the role of
Destabilize
regional
the Middle
peacekeeper,
East.
and it's trying to prevent the war from spreading to other countries. And on another side, the United States is playing a humanitarian role and is trying to prevent the killing of civilians as much as possible. Part of this has included delaying Israel's ground offensive to get civilians off the battlefield. But it's also being realistic that this may not be entirely possible. White House Press Secretary John Kirby said that this is a war, and regardless of U.S. efforts to ensure otherwise, civilians are going to be caught up in it. Watch.
This is war. It is combat. It is bloody. It is ugly, and it's going to be messy. And innocent civilians are going to be hurt going forward. I wish I could tell you something different. I wish that wasn't going to happen, but it is going to happen, and that doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it dismissible. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to still express concerns about that and do everything we can to help the Israelis do everything they can to minimize it. But that's unfortunately the nature of conflict.
This being said, though, Iran represents a whole other piece to the problem. Iran is the force behind many of the terrorist groups and other regional threats. Secretary of State Antony Blinken had this to say at a recent United Nations meeting. Watch.
Now, it is no secret to anyone in this room or on this council that for years, Iran has supported Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other groups that continue to carry out attacks on Israel. Iranian leaders have routinely threatened to wipe Israel off the map. In recent weeks, Iran's proxies have repeatedly attacked U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria, whose mission is to prevent ISIS from renewing its rampage. So, let me say this before this council, and let me say what we've consistently said to Iranian officials through other channels. The United States does not seek conflict with Iran. We do not want this war to widen. But if Iran or its proxies attack U.S. personnel anywhere, make no mistake, we will defend our people, we will defend our security, swiftly and decisively.
Now, you getting that? Iran is behind all the key terror groups involved in this conflict. That includes Hamas, and that includes the groups behind the recent attacks on U.S. forces. Blinken is saying that if Iran attacks U.S. forces, that the United States will retaliate. The big question now, again, given that some smaller attacks have now in fact happened, is what the threshold for U.S. counterattack is going to be. Now, it's possible that the current U.S. response to bolster its forces and defenses in the region and to call out Iran directly, maybe that's the current limit to all this, but we're going to have to wait and see. Now, stay tuned after the break. We'll be speaking to Dinesh